My name is Paige Mercer, and I was 25 the night my parents took me to dinner to tell me I'd been adopted. My mother smiled while she said it, smiled while telling me they'd only kept me for the benefits, and that I wasn't useful to them anymore. My father slid a stack of paperwork across the tablecloth. They'd already filed to cut me out of everything. I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word for almost a minute. Here's what neither of them knew. 6 months before that dinner, I had found my birth family. And that night, I'd seated them 3 tables behind my mother's chair. She just hadn't turned around yet. What happened when she finally did is the reason I'm telling you any of this. 6 years later. Welcome back to the channel, where we tell quiet, true-to-life family stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment someone finally stops shrinking to fit a seat they were never truly offered. If you've ever had to earn your place at your own family's table, this one's for you. Drop a comment and subscribe if you're new. The restaurant was called Von Terre, and I'd never once been taken there in my life. My mother chose it. That should have been my first clue, because Diane Mercer never spent money on me without a reason printed somewhere on the receipt. She wore the gray cashmere she saved for funerals and board meetings. My father, Wesley, had booked the table under her name, not mine. I noticed when the hostess asked, and he answered before I could. No banner, no balloon on my chair, no cake waiting in some back kitchen with my name piped in blue. For a birthday dinner, the table was strangely bare, and the air between my parents carried the careful politeness of people about to read out a verdict. I'd spent 4 years sitting in rooms exactly like this, booking tables like this for clients, for signings, for the quiet conversations families have when somebody dies and the money has to move. I know the difference between a dinner and a deposition. This had the temperature of a deposition. So I did what I always do when a room turns cold. I studied my breathing and counted the exits. That's when I noticed the small brass number on the table behind us. Off to the left, table 9. I held it in my mind, without quite knowing why. The way you note a landmark before you've decided you'll need to find your way back to it. I set my own thing down beside my water glass. A thin manila folder, plain and unremarkable. My mother glanced at it and assumed, I think, it was a resume or maybe a card. She had no idea what I put inside. You have to understand what birthdays meant in our house to understand why none of this surprised me. When I was small, my birthday was one candle. Not a tradition, just one candle pressed into a grocery store cupcake my mother bought on the way home and never bothered to refrigerate. I'd watch it sweat on the counter while she took a call. 3 weeks later, my cousin Brett got a rented bounce house and a caterer with silver trays, because Brett was my Aunt Renee's son. Brett was blood. The year I turned 8, I asked if I could have a party too. My aunt, drinking my mother's wine, answered for her. We can only do one nice thing a month, honey, kindly. That was the part that taught me the most. How kind people can sound while explaining your size to you. So I learned the math. A child who asks for less is cheaper than a child who asks for the same. By 9, I'd stopped asking for cake, because being easy felt like the only currency I had. I didn't tell myself it was sad. I told myself it was efficient. That's the thing about growing up useful. You don't notice you've been priced until somebody reads a number out loud. And across that white tablecloth of Von Terre, 25 years old, I could feel my mother getting ready to read it. I left that house the week I turned 18 with 2 duffel bags and a community college acceptance I'd filled out myself. Nobody drove me. I worked nights at a pharmacy counter, took classes in the mornings, transferred to the state school, and finished a paralegal program while waiting tables on weekends. I paid for all of it. Not because it makes me special, but because it matters for what came later. Nobody handed me a thing. By 25, I was a paralegal at a trust and estates firm downtown, and I was good at it. I spent my days inside other people's wealth, organizing what happens to a life after someone can no longer hold on to it. Beneficiary designations, distribution schedules, the quiet language that decides who eats and who doesn't long after the flowers on the casket wilt. I could read a trust the way some people read a face. The joke of my life, the one I didn't laugh at for years, was this. I could set a perfect boundary for a total stranger. I could tell a grieving widow exactly what she was owed and exactly what she wasn't. But I could not, for the life of me, ask my own family to want me. The only person I ever called without dread was my grandmother. Every Sunday at 4, like clockwork, all through college and after, Nana Ruth. She was the one Mercer who ever made me feel like a person instead of a line item. Nana Ruth Mercer was my father's mother, and something she once said to me turned out to be the hinge the whole night eventually swung on. When I was 12, crying in her kitchen because Brett had told me I wasn't a real Mercer, she put down her dish towel, took my chin in her hand, and said the sentence I carried for the next 13 years. "You were chosen, sweetheart, not collected." Then she made me a grilled cheese and let me stay up too late. Nana died when I was 23. 2 years before that dinner, I gave the only eulogy that spoke of her as a person instead of what she'd leave behind. Within a month of the funeral, my parents quietly moved out of their cramped split level and into the larger house on Linden Road, the one that had been in the family a long time, tied to Nana's name in ways I understood better than they realized. I didn't think much of it then. I was grieving. But there was a thing Nana told me on one of our last Sunday calls, her voice thin over the line, that I filed away without fully understanding. "You'll never have to ask anyone for your own life." I thought it was just encouragement. It would be 6 months before that dinner before I learned she'd meant it literally, in writing and notarized. The year before I turned 25, my family got quiet around me. Not the comfortable kind. Texts that used to come back in an hour started taking 3 days. My mother stopped looping me into holiday planning. Meanwhile, my Aunt Renee got louder, working a new word into the group chat she'd never bothered with before: blood. As in, this is a blood-only weekend at the lake. You understand. I understood perfectly. I just didn't have the paperwork yet to know why the temperature had dropped so fast, all in the same season. Families drift, but this wasn't drift. This was coordinated, and the analyst part of my brain kept flagging at the way you notice 3 unrelated invoices land on the same Tuesday and realize they're not unrelated at all. So when my phone lit up one evening in March with my mother's name and a voice 3 degrees warmer than it had been a year, I didn't feel flattered. I felt the small, cold click of a lock turning somewhere I couldn't see. "Honey," she said. She only called me honey when she wanted something. "We'd like to take you out to celebrate 25 properly, the way we never quite managed." Every instinct built over 4 years of reading other people's bad news told me the same thing. This is too neat. Here's what most people get wrong about my mother. They assume the cruelty is loud. It isn't. The cruelty is in the planning. The cruelty is a woman who never once managed a birthday cake suddenly reserving a corner table and calling it celebrating you properly. When Diane gets generous, it's because a spreadsheet somewhere has told her the generosity will pay for itself. I'd watched her my whole life. I'd just never been the line item before. So I said yes, sweetly, the way she taught me. Then I hung up and sat at my kitchen table a long time doing what I do, thinking about timelines. The house on Linden Road. The word blood showing up in the group chat exactly this season. A sentence my grandmother had said before she died. And the manila folder already sitting in my work bag, assembled 6 months earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with my mother and everything to do with finally knowing where I came from. I didn't call my parents back with questions. I didn't warn them I'd already been to the county clerk. Instead, I made a few calls of my own, quiet ones, the kind you make once you've decided you're not going to be ambushed. You're going to be ready. I won't say yet who I called, but I'll tell you the rule I live by, the one Nana never said out loud, but taught me anyway. When my mother turns sweet, someone at the table is about to lose something. I made sure this time it wouldn't be me. People assume a story like this is about money. I understand why. There's a will somewhere, a house, a folder slid across a table. But sitting in my car in the Von Terre parking lot that night, engine off, hands steady on the wheel, the thing I feared losing had no dollar amount attached. I was afraid of losing the last idea I had that I'd ever belonged anywhere. As cold as that house had been, as transactional as every candle and every hand-me-down casserole, it was still the only origin story I had. They were still, technically, my parents. If they cut that thread tonight the way I suspected they'd come to, I'd be exactly what Brett called me at 12. Not a real Mercer, just a girl somebody picked up and put down. That was the wound they were aiming for, and they knew it, because it was the wound they'd been pressing my whole life. What they didn't account for was that the wound had already closed. 6 months can do that, if the right people find you. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror, tucked the folder under my arm, and walked across that lot with the particular calm of someone who's already read the last page of a book everyone else thinks is still being written. I wasn't walking into a disownment. I was walking into a goodbye I'd already chosen. They just didn't know it yet. We ordered drinks before anyone said a true thing. My mother praised the wine list. My father told a parking story he'd already told in the car. Then, somewhere between the bread and the entree nobody would end up eating, Diane folded her hands and shifted into the voice. The one she used the time she returned a Christmas gift in front of me and explained why it hadn't been practical. "We've always done our very best for you," she began. Wesley nodded along, a half-second behind her, the way he'd nodded behind her for 30 years. "We gave you a roof, an education. More than some children ever get." I let her talk. I rested one hand flat on the folder beside my plate and watched my father's eyes flick down to it and away. The tab had a typed label. He could see 4 letters of it if he looked. He looked. I covered the rest with my thumb, not to hide it, just to let him wonder, and I watched the wondering start working on him. She kept going about sacrifice, about how a child should understand the cost of being raised. I thought about a sweating cupcake and 1 candle, and said nothing. Then she paused, took a small, precise sip of wine, and set the glass down like a woman reaching a line she'd rehearsed. "There's something, Paige, that you should have been told a very long time ago." She said it the way you'd announce a change to a dinner reservation. "You're adopted. We adopted you as an infant. You were never biologically ours. We never planned to keep this from you forever." She watched my face while she said it, waiting for the collapse. This was the moment she'd built the entire evening around. The corner table, the cashmere, the practice pauses, all engineered to land right here, on the second her adopted daughter learned she'd been a stranger all along and broken to pieces my mother could sweep up and walk away from. I'd love to tell you it didn't land. It landed. Some part of a person always braces for the floor to be there, and mine had just been told there was no floor. But I'd had 6 months already to absorb this, and the only thing my mother actually revealed that night was how little she knew about me. She leaned in, almost gentle, and delivered the line I will hear in waiting rooms and quiet kitchens for the rest of my life. "We only kept you for the benefits." She smiled when she said it. That smile was the detail that freed me in the end, not the cruelty. I'd been raised on the cruelty. A woman does not smile delivering the worst news of your life unless she's rehearsed the choreography enough to enjoy it. In her smile, I finally saw the whole shape of it. I hadn't been a daughter who disappointed them. I'd been an asset that had finished depreciating. Benefits is a clean word for a dirty arrangement, and my father, to his discredit, tried to explain it like an accountant defending a tax position. There were assistance payments in the early years, Wesley said, not meeting my eyes. The adoption came with a small monthly subsidy when you were little. That ran out years ago, back in grade school. There were tax considerations after that. And your grandmother, of course, though he didn't say her name that way, had certain expectations about family. Adopting you helped meet those expectations. And meeting them turned out to be, in his careful accountant's word, worthwhile for a good many years. I sat very still and let the arithmetic of my childhood rearrange itself into its true equation. The 1 cupcake. The hand-me-downs from Brett that still had the return tags from Renee's returns on them. The way the heat got turned down in my room first. They hadn't been poor. They'd been pocketing the difference between what a child costs and what a child generates. I had been the generator. "We invested in you," Wesley said, as if that settled it, as if a child were a rental property with a depreciation curve. My mother, impatient with his bookkeeping, cut to the line underneath all the others, the one the whole evening had been built to deliver. "The subsidy's been gone since you were a child, Paige. And what came after it ends today. You're 25 now. There's simply nothing further that keeping you up does for us." She said it almost regretfully, the way you'd note a coupon had expired. "You're not useful." 2 sentences, and they'd reduced a quarter-century of being their daughter to a line that had stopped producing income. I reached for my water. My hand did not shake. I noticed that, and I filed it away as a small, surprising gift. Then my father did the thing he'd come to do. He reached into the leather portfolio he'd brought, the one I'd assumed held a birthday card, and slid a thin sheaf of papers across the tablecloth until it touched my plate. "We've already filed," he said, "to formalize things. You won't be in the will. You won't be a beneficiary on anything of ours. We wanted to do this cleanly, in person, so there'd be no confusion later." He'd rehearsed the word cleanly. I could hear the lawyer who'd coached him. And here's the part I've never been able to make my family understand, the part that turned the whole night for me, without a single word from me. I read the caption on the first page in about 4 seconds. the way I've read 1,000 of them, and saw immediately what they'd done. They'd filed against the wrong instrument. They'd spent good money cutting me out of an estate that was almost beside the point, while leaving entirely untouched the document that actually decided everything. They thought the power in that room ran through their own modest will. That's where they'd aimed their expensive little knife. I didn't correct them. You don't tell the other side they've sued the wrong defendant. You let them finish. So I slid the papers an inch back toward the center of the table, neither accepting nor refusing, and let them keep believing they'd won. Across the table, my Aunt Renee's voice arrived on speakerphone from my mother's purse. Because of course Renee was listening, because Renee had been the architect of half of this. Blood looks after blood, Paige, she said, warm as a knife in soup. You've always understood that. I didn't cry. I want to be honest. Part of me had expected to. Some 12-year-old still living in my chest had been braced for exactly this table since the night Brett told her she wasn't real. But 25-year-old me just took a slow sip of water and set the glass down without a sound. And I watched something cross my mother's face I'd genuinely never seen there before. Disappointment. Not at me. At the performance. She'd written this scene with a sobbing girl in the lead role, and the girl wasn't sobbing, and it was ruining her ending. Aren't you going to say anything? She asked, an edge creeping in now, the brittleness of a woman whose script has gone off the rails. I considered the question, considered everything I could have said, 25 years backed up behind one small dam. And then she made the mistake people like her always make. She filled the silence by reaching for the line that worked the first time, expecting it to work again. We only kept you for the benefits, she repeated, slower, leaning on each word, trying to draw blood she could see. But a sentence loses its teeth the second time you hear it from the same mouth. The first time it had been a revelation. The second time, it was just a confession, and not about me. It told me everything about her, and nothing about my worth. I set my napkin in my lap, smoothed it once, and let her watch me not break. Behind her, at table 9, I saw a woman with my exact chin turn her head toward our table and go still. To explain what was in my folder, I need to take you back 6 months, to the week 2 envelopes arrived and changed the arithmetic of my whole life. After Nana died, I'd registered with the state's adoption reunion registry, half certain nothing would come of it. 8 weeks later, a letter arrived in careful, looping handwriting I didn't recognize, from Susan Hale. She wrote that she'd been 19 when she gave me up, that she hadn't wanted to, that she'd thought of me every March for 25 years, and that she'd drive any distance, any day, no expectations, if I ever wanted to meet her. Beneath her signature, I never stopped saving you a seat. The second envelope arrived 3 days later, and it had nothing to do with Susan, or so I thought. While waiting on my own birth records, I requested the file on Nana's estate too, professional habit, and there it was, in the distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust, executed 2 years before her death and administered not by my parents but by a bank. The caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter Paige. Not their estate. Hers, held by a trustee they couldn't touch, scheduled to leave their hands forever on the exact date they'd chosen for that dinner. 2 envelopes in 1 week. One told me where I come from. The other told me, in my grandmother's notarized hand, exactly what my parents were about to lose and why they were suddenly in such a hurry. I didn't call my mother and scream the discovery down the phone. That's not a weapon I trust. What I had was processed, so I used it. I took a personal day, drove the trust documents to an estate attorney with no connection to my family, and paid her out of my own savings to confirm what I suspected. The distributions were legitimate, ongoing, and ending. My parents have been drawing a monthly sum for nearly 2 decades. The remainder passed to me by the trust's own terms through a corporate trustee. Nothing my parents could file, sign, or shred to stop. Their will was irrelevant to it. Their disownment was theater performed on the wrong stage. My attorney asked if I want to notify them, soften the landing. I said no. I wanted 3 things in a folder. The retainer letter, so they'd know I had counsel. The trust distribution schedule, so they'd see the date in black and white. And my original birth certificate, with Susan Hale's name in the mother's line, so the table would understand exactly which family I was choosing to leave and which one I was keeping. I labeled the tab, closed the folder, and carried it for 6 months like a quiet engine I hadn't turned on yet. I met Susan Hale for the first time at a diner halfway between our cities because she didn't want me to have to drive too far. That small consideration undid me more than any speech could have. She was nervous, opening and closing a photo album without quite showing me, as if she wasn't sure she'd earned the right. She had my chin and my habit of going quiet when I felt too much. I learned I had a half-brother, Danny, 20, all elbows and questions, who texted me memes within a week as if I'd always been there to receive them. I learned my birth grandmother was a small, ferocious woman named Pearl, who took one look at me and said, "Well, there she is, like I'd just been running late, not gone for a quarter century." They never asked me for anything, and that was the part my nervous system couldn't parse. No favors, no money, no role to perform. The third time we met, Susan told me the line that would become the truest sentence of my life. "We've kept a seat for you, sweetheart. We never gave it to anyone else." And I, who could draft a flawless beneficiary clause for a stranger, who knew the precise legal language of belonging, sat in a vinyl booth and didn't know what to do with my own hands, because I'd been wanted, for the first time, by people who got nothing out of wanting me. There's a difference between being needed and being wanted, and I'd only ever known one of them. Being needed is a job. You show up, you produce, you stay easy, and in exchange you get to keep your seat another quarter. I'd mistaken the steadiness of that for love, the way you can mistake a long commute for a destination, just because you make it every day. What Susan and Danny and Pearl offer had no job attached, and that terrified me more than my mother ever had. The first time Susan called just to ask how my week was, no agenda underneath it. I waited the whole conversation for the catch. When there wasn't one, I had to pull my car over because I couldn't see the road. I tested them in small ways I'm not proud of, canceling plans to see if they'd punish me. They never did. They just said, "No worries, next time," and meant it. I tried to pay for everything, to earn my seat. Pearl finally took my face in her hands the way Nana used to and said, "You don't have to buy your way in here. We already paid." Slowly, a knot I'd carried since I was 9 began, not to vanish, but to loosen. I started to believe, against 25 years of evidence, that a person could simply want me in the room. So when my mother called to invite me to celebrate 25 properly, I already knew where I wanted to spend the evening. I just decided to spend it everywhere at once. The night my mother booked Vontaire, I called Susan and asked her a question I'd been too afraid to ask anyone in my life. Would she come to my birthday dinner? I explained the whole shape of it. The parents, the suspicions, the trust, the speech I could feel coming. I told her I didn't know exactly what they planned to say, but I knew I didn't want to hear it alone, and I no longer wanted to perform the grief they were counting on. Susan didn't hesitate for even a second. "What time and where? Should we dress up?" Then she said something that made me put a hand over my mouth in my own kitchen. "We'd be honored to watch you not need them." So I made one more call, to Vontaire, and booked a second table for that same evening, under my own name. Paige Mercer, party of 3, table 9, near the back, the host told me, 3 tables behind the reservation already on the books for a Mercer party of 3 at the front. I almost laughed at the geometry of it. They had no idea they'd be performing my disownment within sight of the family that had spent 25 years saving me a chair. I told Susan, Pearl, and Danny to arrive a little after us, order quietly, simply be there, and let me come to them when I was ready. I won't pretend I didn't want them in that room. I did. There's a reason the truth lands harder spoken in front of people than mailed in a letter, and I'd seen enough confrontations to know a private one only ever becomes the other side's word against yours. So yes, I wanted witnesses, and I'm not ashamed of it. But Susan, Pearl, and Danny were never just witnesses to me, and that's the whole difference between what they were doing and what my mother was doing. The folder was how I'd make my parents understand they'd lost. Table 9 was where I'd go to remember I'd already won. Back at the front table, my mother decided the silence had gone on long enough and moved to close the deal. She produced one more page from the leather portfolio, turned it to face me, and set an uncapped pen across it like a small gift. "It's just an acknowledgement," she said, "that we've informed you, that you understand the situation. Sign it, and we can all have a civilized dinner." I didn't have to read far. The release paragraph opened with boilerplate I'd typed 100 times myself. "The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy. It wasn't an acknowledgement. It was a waiver wearing one, designed to have me agree on the record that I'd been notified and had no claim, drafted to head off exactly the challenge I was in a position to bring. They wanted my signature while I was still bleeding, before the shock wore off enough to think. My mother was counting on my wound. I didn't call my mother and scream the discovery down the phone. That's not a weapon I trust. What I had was processed, so I used it. I took a personal day, drove the trust documents to an estate attorney with no connection to my family, and paid her out of my own savings to confirm what I suspected. The distributions were legitimate, ongoing, and ending. My parents have been drawing a monthly sum for nearly 2 decades. The remainder passed to me by the trust's own terms through a corporate trustee. Nothing my parents could file, sign, or shred to stop. Their will was irrelevant to it. Their disownment was theater performed on the wrong stage. My attorney asked if I wanted to notify them, soften the landing. I said no. I wanted 3 things in a folder. The retainer letter, so they'd know I had counsel. The trust distribution schedule, so they'd see the date in black and white. And my original birth certificate, with Susan Hale's name in the mother's line, so the table would understand exactly which family I was choosing to leave and which one I was keeping. I labeled the tab, closed the folder, and carried it for 6 months like a quiet engine I hadn't turned on yet. I met Susan Hale for the first time at a diner halfway between our cities, because she didn't want me to have to drive too far. That small consideration undid me more than any speech could have. She was nervous, opening and closing a photo album without quite showing me, as if she wasn't sure she'd earned the right. She had my chin and my habit of going quiet when I felt too much. I learned I had a half-brother, Danny, 20, all elbows and questions, who texted me memes within a week as if I'd always been there to receive them. I learned my birth grandmother was a small, ferocious woman named Pearl, who took one look at me and said, "Well, there she is, like I'd just been running late, not gone for a quarter century." They never asked me for anything, and that was the part my nervous system couldn't parse. No favors, no money, no role to perform. The 3rd time we met, Susan told me the line that would become the truest sentence of my life. "We've kept a seat for you, sweetheart. We never gave it to anyone else." And I, who could draft a flawless beneficiary clause for a stranger, who knew the precise legal language of belonging, sat in a vinyl booth and didn't know what to do with my own hands, because I'd been wanted, for the first time, by people who got nothing out of wanting me. There's a difference between being needed and being wanted, and I'd only ever known one of them. Being needed is a job. You show up, you produce, you stay easy, and in exchange you get to keep your seat another quarter. I'd mistaken the steadiness of that for love, the way you can mistake a long commute for a destination, just because you make it every day. What Susan and Danny and Pearl offer had no job attached, and that terrified me more than my mother ever had. The first time Susan called just to ask how my week was, no agenda underneath it. I waited the whole conversation for the catch. When there wasn't one, I had to pull my car over because I couldn't see the road. I tested them in small ways I'm not proud of, canceling plans to see if they'd punish me. They never did. They just said, "No worries, next time," and meant it. I tried to pay for everything, to earn my seat. Pearl finally took my face in her hands the way Nana used to and said, "You don't have to buy your way in here. We already paid." Slowly, a knot I'd carried since I was 9 began, not to vanish, but to loosen. I started to believe, against 25 years of evidence, that a person could simply want me in the room. So when my mother called to invite me to celebrate 25 properly, I already knew where I wanted to spend the evening. I just decided to spend it everywhere at once. The night my mother booked Von Terre, I called Susan and asked her a question I'd been too afraid to ask anyone in my life. Would she come to my birthday dinner? I explained the whole shape of it, the parents, the suspicions, the trust, the speech I could feel coming. I told her I didn't know exactly what they planned to say, but I knew I didn't want to hear it alone, and I no longer wanted to perform the grief they were counting on. Susan didn't hesitate for even a second. "What time and where? Should we dress up?" Then she said something that made me put a hand over my mouth in my own kitchen. "We'd be honored to watch you not need them." So I made one more call, to Von Terre, and booked a second table for that same evening, under my own name. Paige Mercer, party of 3, table 9, near the back, the host told me, 3 tables behind the reservation already on the books for a Mercer party of 3 at the front. I almost laughed at the geometry of it. They had no idea they'd be performing my disownment within sight of the family that had spent 25 years saving me a chair. I told Susan, Pearl, and Danny to arrive a little after us, order quietly, simply be there, and let me come to them when I was ready. I won't pretend I didn't want them in that room. I did. There's a reason the truth lands harder spoken in front of people than mailed in a letter, and I'd seen enough confrontations to know a private one only ever becomes the other side's word against yours. So yes, I wanted witnesses, and I'm not ashamed of it. But Susan, Pearl, and Danny were never just witnesses to me, and that's the whole difference between what they were doing and what my mother was doing. The folder was how I'd make my parents understand they'd lost. Table 9 was where I'd go to remember I'd already won. Back at the front table, my mother decided the silence had gone on long enough and moved to close the deal. She produced one more page from the leather portfolio, turned it to face me, and set an uncapped pen across it like a small gift. "It's just an acknowledgement," she said, "that we've informed you, that you understand the situation. Sign it, and we can all have a civilized dinner." I didn't have to read far. The release paragraph opened with boilerplate I'd typed 100 times myself. "The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy." It wasn't an acknowledgement. It was a waiver wearing one, designed to have me agree on the record that I'd been notified and had no claim, drafted to head off exactly the challenge I was in a position to bring. They wanted my signature while I was still bleeding, before the shock wore off enough to think. My mother was counting on my wound. She didn't know it had a trust attached to it. I left the pen where it lay. My father kept glancing at my folder, worry climbing his neck in a slow red tide. He'd always been the one who knew where the money actually lived, and he was doing the arithmetic now, the same arithmetic I'd done 6 months earlier. "Is there something we should know, Paige?" I smiled at him, the first real smile of the night. "Not yet," I said. That was when Aunt Renee arrived in person, Brett trailing behind her, both feigning the surprise of people who'd been waiting in the bar for a text. "Paige, what a coincidence," Renee said, pressing a cold cheek to mine. I understood instantly that Diane had summoned reinforcements. Renee pulled up a chair without asking. Brett, 26, and still dressing like his mother bought his clothes, gave me the look I'd been getting since childhood, the one that says you're always going to end up at the kids' table eventually. Renee got right to it, subtlety never being her instrument. "We just want what's best for the family," she said, laying a manicured hand over my mother's. "Families have to make hard choices about who's really part of them. Blood looks after blood." There it was again, the word she'd been seeding in the group chat all year, finally said aloud at the table it had been built for. I looked at my aunt, who'd answered for my mother the day I turned 8, and explained to a child why she wasn't worth a party, and felt the last thread of obligation in me go slack. These weren't people I was losing. They were people I was finally setting down. I'd carried them a long way, longer than they deserved, and my arms were gloriously tired. Across the table, my father wasn't joining in, staring at his hands. Then, while Renee was mid-sentence about the family's wishes, Wesley leaned toward me and said something low, just for me. "Your grandmother loved you." He stopped there. For a moment, I saw the whole other version of Wesley Mercer, the one who might have existed if he'd ever once chosen a harder thing over a comfortable one. His eyes were wet. He'd loved his mother. I knew that much was true, and some part of him understood the woman he'd loved had built a wall around me with her own money precisely because she didn't trust her son to protect me. That had to be a terrible thing to sit with over dinner. I waited, because there was a version of that night where my father said the next sentence, the apology, the "I'm sorry, this is wrong, I won't do this," and I would have heard it and it would have mattered. But he looked at my mother, who was watching him the way a handler watches a dog that's wandered too close to the road, and I saw him choose. He sat back. He picked up his water. The almost sentence died in his throat, where so many of his almost sentences had died over the years. That was the closest thing to love anyone at the front table offered me all night, and it lasted 4 words and a swallow. I didn't hate him for it. You can't hate a man for being exactly the weight you always knew he was. But I understood, finally, that the reason they'd filed in such a hurry, the reason for the whole rushed, cruel evening, was sitting right behind his wet eyes. He knew about Nana's trust. He'd known the date was coming. He'd hoped desperately to get my signature on a waiver before I ever found out what his mother had done for me. So I asked him a question, not loudly, not as a daughter, but in the voice I use at the firm when I've found the flaw in someone's filing, and I'm giving them the dignity of noticing it themselves. Dad, which instrument did you file under? Your estate or Nana's trust? The table went quiet in a new way. My mother's wine glass paused halfway to her mouth. Renee's manicured hand stopped patting. Wesley blinked at me like I'd started speaking a language he half recognized from a country he'd never visited. Because in 8 words I told them 3 things they hadn't budgeted for. That I knew there was a difference between the 2 instruments, that I knew which one mattered, and that I'd known long enough to learn the vocabulary cold. My mother had never heard me use that voice before. None of them had. To them, I'd always been the quiet one, the easy one, the girl who took the smaller slice so the table could stay pleasant. They'd built this entire evening on the assumption that I would receive my fate, not audit it. What? My mother said, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. What are you talking about? I let the question sit. I've learned the most powerful thing in any room is the person who doesn't need to rush to the answer. I turned my water glass a quarter turn on the cloth, lined it up with the edge of the folder, and looked at my father, who'd gone very pale, who already knew, and who was silently begging me with his eyes not to open it. Then I opened it. No flourish, no slam document, no speech. I simply turned the folder to face them and laid the 3 pages out on the white cloth, side by side, the way I'd lay exhibits in front of a client who needed to understand their own situation. First, the retainer letter, with the firm's letterhead and the line confirming I was represented by counsel. Second, the distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust, the relevant paragraph already there in black and white. Third, my original birth certificate, Susan Hale's name when my mother had assumed her own belonged. I didn't point at anything. I let the paper do the work paper always does. My mother's eyes went straight to the trust schedule, because of course they did. Some animal part of her had always known where the money slept. I watched her read. The caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter Paige. I watched her reach the word remainder and the word Paige, and I watched the color drain from her face top down, like a window shade being drawn. She looked up at me, then at Wesley, then back down, the way people do, hoping a second reading might say something kinder than the first. It never does. Mom, I said gently, because I could afford gentleness now. You filed against the wrong family. The one you cut me out of was always the smaller one. My mother is a fast woman. I'll give her that. Even cornered, it took her only about 10 seconds to assemble the full picture. The house on Linden Road, funded by the trust she'd assumed she'd live in forever. The distribution stopping tonight by their own terms. The remainder, the real money she'd lived adjacent to for 2 decades without ever controlling, passing this exact date to the daughter she'd just told she was finished with. And the waiver, seconds from my signature, worth precisely nothing, since it released a claim on an estate that had never held a value at all. She'd aimed every weapon she owned at a will and missed the trust entirely. The cruelty had been free. The mistake had been expensive. Here's the last thing my mother had to teach me. People like her never apologize at the moment they're caught. They pivot. Her face rearranged itself, the cold draining out, a terrible warmth flooding in. She reached across the table for my hand. Paige, she said, voice gone soft and wet, we're still your parents. Whatever's in those papers doesn't change what we are. We're family. The word family, from the mouth that 20 minutes earlier had said we only kept you for the benefits. I looked at her hand reaching for mine and did not take it. The same sentence that had been her weapon was now, in this light, the confession that cleared me to leave. People expect this as the part where I made them pay, detailed exactly what the remainder was worth, watched them squirm. I understand the appetite for it. But the strongest position in any room isn't the one holding the biggest number. It's the one that doesn't need the number at all. I had a career I'd built with my own hands, savings I'd earned waiting tables and drafting documents. I didn't need Nana's remainder to be free, and that, more than any dollar figure, was what my mother could not survive understanding. So I closed the folder, gathered the 3 pages back in, unhurried, and left the pen they'd brought for my surrender neatly beside her plate. I'd won the thing they thought we were fighting over before any of us sat down. And I'd won it by knowing, by preparing, by refusing to be ambushed. There was nothing left to argue. There was only the choice of where to spend the rest of my birthday. I'd made that choice 6 months earlier, in a vinyl diner booth, when a nervous woman with my chin slid a photo album across the table and didn't ask me for a single thing. I administer estates for a living, and I'll tell you what I tell every client circled by people who only appear when there's something to gain. If someone in your life shows up only when you're useful, you already know what that is, and no amount of shared history makes it love. Type boundaries below if you've had to learn the hard way. And subscribe, because the part you came for is about to happen. I stood up the way you'd rise for any table. No drama, just a woman pushing her chair back and reaching for a folder. But the effect on the front table was immediate. My mother's hand hung in the air where mine should have been. "Sit down," she said, the soft maternal mask slipping, the old cold control snapping back in her voice like a bone setting. "Sit down, Paige. Where on earth do you think you're going?" Renee straightened. Brett, for once, stopped smirking. My father just looked tired. The look of a man watching the only good thing his mother ever did walk out of his reach forever. I picked up the folder, held it against my chest, and looked at my mother, who'd spent 25 years, and this expensive dinner, trying to make me understand I had no real place anywhere. I told her exactly where I was going. "My birth family is sitting 3 tables behind you." I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. The sentence had been true for the entire meal, true while she smiled and rehearsed, and slid her waiver across the cloth. She believed she was performing my disownment for an audience of strangers. She hadn't been performing it for strangers. She'd been performing it within arm's reach of the people who'd been saving me a chair since long before she decided I'd stopped being useful. I watched my words travel across the table and land. I watched my mother begin, very slowly, to turn around at her seat. She turned the way you turn when some part of you already knows and is begging the rest of you to be wrong. Her cashmere shoulders rotated, her chin came around, and there at table 9, 3 tables back, under the warm low light, sat Susan, Pearl, and Danny, who had been there the entire time, who had ordered quietly and eaten almost nothing, who had watched my mother deliver the worst sentences of my life, and had kept their seats and their composure because I'd asked them to let me come to them. Susan met my mother's eyes first. She didn't glare, didn't gloat. She just looked at the woman who'd raised her daughter on 1 candle and a calculator. Then she looked at me, and her whole face opened like a window in spring. Pearl, small and ferocious, already had her napkin folded by her plate, ready. Danny had stopped pretending to look at his phone. My mother's gaze went from Susan's chin to mine and back, doing the resemblance math, and I saw the exact moment she understood. The family she just told me I didn't have was sitting 15 feet behind her, in real chairs at a real table, having watched her do the one thing she could never take back, in front of witnesses she never knew she had. She turned back to me. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had no script. And in the silence where her next cruel line should have been, a chair scraped back at table 9. All 3 of them stood, not to make a scene, not to confront anyone, just to be on their feet when I crossed the room to them, the way you stand for someone arriving at a gate after a long flight. Pearl stood first because Pearl does everything first, then Susan, then Danny, knocking his knee on the table leg in his hurry. They didn't say a word to my parents. They didn't have to. Their standing said the whole thing. The restaurant had gone quiet around us. The particular hush of strangers who can feel something true happening and have stopped pretending not to watch. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray. I walked past my mother, still turned half around her chair. Past Renee, whose mouth had finally run out of the word blood. Past my father, who lifted his eyes to me as I passed, then dropped them again, choosing comfort one last time. 15 feet. 3 tables. 25 years. When I reached them, Pearl took my face in both her hands the way Nana used to, and Susan pulled out the empty 4th chair beside her own, the one they'd asked the host to set even though their reservation was only for 3. "We saved you a seat," she said, the same word she'd written under her name in that first letter, gone soft from all my reading. "We always did." I sat down in it, in the seat that had been waiting my whole life, at the table that had wanted me before they even knew if I'd come. That's when my mother lost the one thing she'd never lost in front of people, her composure. I heard her chair scrape, heard the calm she'd worn all evening crack straight down the middle. "After everything we paid for," she said, and it carried across the dining room now, sharp and rising. The schools, the roof, the years. You humiliate your family over money. Heads turned openly. A man at the bar set down his drink. Renee hissed, "Diane, sit down, people are looking." But my mother was past her own handler's reach for the first time in her life, because the script was gone, and all that was left was the truth coming out sideways. "We gave you everything," she said to a room full of strangers. She said gave, not loved. Even cornered, the word love wouldn't come. It had never been in the inventory. I stayed in my seat at table 9, didn't stand to match her, didn't raise my voice to meet hers. Susan's hand had found mine under the table, and I let my mother be loud, because the loudness was doing my work for me. Every person in that restaurant was watching a calm young woman seated among people who clearly adored her, and a furious older woman shouting about everything she'd paid for. Nobody hears a parent screaming about money and thinks, "Ah, there's the real family." My father never stood at all. He just put his face in his hands. I let her run out of words the way a storm runs out of rain. When the quiet came back, I did one last thing before giving my full attention to my actual family. I walked the 3 tables back to the front and set a single page down on the white cloth in front of her, the trust distribution schedule. I left it face up. I didn't need it anymore. My attorney had the originals, and I wanted my mother to have something to read on the longest evening of her life. "You can keep this one," I said. "You'll want to understand what ended today and what didn't." She stared at the page. Wesley reached for it, then didn't. I looked at the two of them, my mother, who had priced me at 1 candle, and my father, who had loved his own mother too much to honor what she'd asked of him, and said the only sentence I prepared in advance, the one I'd written in my head in the parking lot and decided I'd only use if I earned it. "You kept me for the benefits." They kept a seat for me. Then I turned and walked back to table 9, and I did not look behind me again. Not when Renee called my name. Not when my mother said something I couldn't hear and didn't want to. I sat back down beside Susan. Pearl had ordered me a slice of chocolate cake while I was gone, and Danny had stuck the little restaurant candle in it. 1 candle lit. For a second the symmetry caught in my throat. Then Susan leaned over. "Blow it out, sweetheart. Make the wish." I realized I didn't have one. I already had it. The trust did exactly what my grandmother built it to do. On my 25th birthday, the caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer ended on the date, and by the terms Nana had notarized 2 years before her death. The remainder passed to me through the bank trustee, untouched by the will my parents had spent good money revising, because you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you never controlled in the first place. Their waiver, and signed, was worth exactly what it had always been worth: nothing. Within a year, my parents sold the house on Linden Road, unable to carry it without the distributions, and moved into something smaller. I'm told Renee was furious to learn none of Nana's money would ever flow toward Brett after all. The story of that dinner traveled the way these stories do, through the family and then past it, and a version where Diane Mercer is the devoted mother wronged by an ungrateful adopted daughter never quite took. Because too many strangers of Ontario had watched a woman scream about everything she'd paid for while a quiet girl held hands with the family across the room. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't post anything. I simply stopped answering and let the silence be the boundary, which is the only kind that ever holds. My father texted me once, a few weeks later. 3 words: "I am sorry." No name, no follow-up. I never replied. I heard later that when Renee tried to rally the family to contest Nana's trust, it was Wesley who quietly shut it down, telling them their mother had every right to leave her money where she pleased, that it was hers, that it was finished. He was right. He was also, as ever, a year too late, saying it to the wrong room, when it cost him nothing and changed nothing. That was the whole of my father in the end, a man who knew the right thing, even felt it, and could only ever bring himself to do it once doing it stopped requiring anything of him. I didn't need the apology, but I was glad, in a small, clean way, that he'd finally said something right out loud. I spent that first real birthday eating chocolate cake at table 9 with people who got nothing from wanting me, and I've spent every birthday since with them. Susan and I talk every Sunday now, at 4, the hour I used to save for Nana. Pearl taught me to make her grilled cheese. Danny still sends memes. Somewhere in a drawer of my new family's kitchen, there's a photo album that doesn't close anymore, because it finally has enough pages. Being useful was all my parents ever wanted from me, and being wanted was the one thing I'd never had. It took 25 years and one terrible dinner to learn that anyone who only keeps you for the benefits has already told you, in the plainest language there is, that they were never your family at all. That's my story. One candle for 24 years, and on the 25th, a whole table that lit them all without being asked. If someone in your life only values you when you're useful, take this as your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You don't have to earn the people who love you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.